I can start. Well, I'm very privileged to introduce Michael Mann, who really doesn't require any further introduction since most of these very distinguished people here today know how distinguished he is already. He's going to speak to us on the title of Production and Predation, the European Imperial Miracle.
Thank you. Well, my main encounter with Ernest was in the Patterns of History series of seminars at LSE in the 1980s, which Ernest, John Hall and I organized together, and which we, I think, all derived, certainly I derived enormous benefit from, both from Ernest and from John, and from our guests, our many guests who came and gave talks. And then we all wrote books about, overlapping books, about the kind of, it wasn't necessarily our term, the European miracle, that is the enormous breakthrough to modernity which occurred in Europe. And we all argued that this was a kind of unprecedented breakthrough, and that it was fairly deep-rooted in different aspects of European society. It might have depended on a whole series of accidents. They occurred over a long period of time and not merely at the end of the 18th century and early 19th century, as a kind of anti-Orientalists have subsequently argued. And I think that that argument stands up reasonably well. There is a section of my paper in which I defend this and refer to Ernest, and I point out that though Ernest was very much concerned with the emergence of an industrial society, and especially its ability to develop a universal bribery fund, and therefore move from predation to production, that his explanation for this was not basically economistic or materialistic, but depended more on what I would call political and ideological power. That is, that the freedom of expression, the political and ideological liberties developed in Europe were essentially responsible for the European miracle. Political freedom, freedom of thought, and freedom from all authority, whether that was secular, spiritual, or magical. And this kind of liberalism enabled, he said, human society to escape from predation into production, into a society where, for the first time, increasing wealth would not be seized by the kings, the cousins, and the thugs, which is how he described previous ruling classes of agrarian societies, but it would be distributed through the population as a whole. And indeed, to a large extent, this did transpire in Western Europe, especially in those societies that he would have considered liberal. Okay? Now, Ernest never, however, really looked at one aspect of the European miracle, and indeed I didn't at that point, which is the taking of this miracle abroad to the world. And the other aspect of the European miracle was the fairly short-lived, but nonetheless brief, thoroughgoing conquest of the world, or virtually all of the world. Far East Asia was somewhat out of the logistical reach of the Europeans, and though they were able to mess up China considerably, they were unable to actually impose any empire on China and some other parts of East Asia, and certainly not Japan, of course. Now, the question is this something which is just something which isn't very much to do with European society at home and European liberalism? And I think as soon as you begin to think about it, you realize that no, imperialism is an essential part of the European miracle. Europeans didn't actually outcompete the world. They didn't simply outcompete the world. They did conquer it. They imposed coercive empires on most of it. So far as I know, Ernest didn't write about this in any sustained way, and certainly his essay on war and violence, he passes straight from agrarian to industrial societies without mentioning empires. His examples of empires are of different kinds of empires and not the European empires overseas. Yet the imperial miracle, what I'll call the imperial miracle, was very much a part of the broader miracle in Europe itself. And it involves similar tendencies and similar institutions. Just as in Europe, the leading edge of European imperialism, passed from Catholic authoritarian to Protestant constitutional regime, and most especially to liberal Great Britain. Imperialism involved comparable kinds of actors, the trading companies as well as states, and in the British case, the trading companies almost always led the way. Eventually the state would come in with, because only it had the resources to consolidate what the trading companies had started. But the distinctive British thing, imitating the Dutch, was the independent entrepreneurial trading company. The individual actors, too, very entrepreneurial, whatever form of power they happen to mobilize. In Africa, for example, very many freelance promoters, adventurers, missionaries, entrepreneurs, and often independent soldiers hiring themselves out to perhaps their own state or to other states. Men like Stanley, Bratza, Rhodes, and Haugaard, with blank treaty forms in their pockets and commerce, Christianity, and civilization in their hearts, as has been said. Even the King of the Belgians formed his own private company. That is, there was not a Belgian empire, there was an empire of the King of the Belgians. And the ships of the explorers and those who went out to foreign lands reveals that mixture of science and enterprise, especially in the French case, actually more than in the British case. Perhaps we're a bit too obsessed by Newton and we forget about the French scientists as well. Their ships, discovery, resolution, adventure, endeavor, géographie, naturaliste, l'astrolabe, and la boussole. These are the ships which plant the flag of Great Britain or France across the world. Empire, like the miracle at home, involved a large number of autonomous actors and companies and states too, all competing with one another. And it does culminate in the British Empire, ruler in 1920 of a quarter of the world's land surface. Undoubtedly, by then, back home, a thoroughly liberal kingdom. Its principal rival, Republican France, also, in its slightly different way, clearly liberal. So I am looking at these distinctive, at the most liberal empire, the British Empire, and I'm forgetting about the other cases for the moment. Well, you have this basic contradiction going on. The development of representative government, of civil, political, and social rights back home, and the conquest of the world through violence, through predation, mass killing, slavery, racism, authoritarian government. Now, we obviously need a more nuanced view of the relationship between production and predation in the modern world, even in the liberal case. So what I'm going to do is go briefly through the four sources of social power and try and give a kind of, as it were, an overall narrative of empire which tries to tease out the relations between production and predation. Starting with military power. Now, the Europeans were peculiarly militaristic. What had not struck me before I did more comparative work on the modern period, is just how much warfare there was in Europe as a continent compared to other continents of the world in recent times. And there's a section in this paper about why this was so, and I'm going to skip over that. I'm going to just take that for granted. I can defend it if necessary. But Europeans were unusually warlike, I essentially argue, in that there were already mini-empires within Europe. The main states, those that eventually go out to the world, grew by colonizing their near neighbors, as people in this country obviously know above all, because Ireland was often used as a laboratory for empire elsewhere, and Londonderry was the model plantation colony for the rest of the world. But through repeated wars inside the continent, Europeans have been able to refine techniques of war which were unusually effective at concentrating intensive firepower on the enemy and defeating them. So that by the time that Europeans go out into the world, They have very compact, not particularly large forces, which are superior at firepower in an intensive way. Now, to begin with, they have no advantage of technique. They develop of the weapons themselves. They develop naval superiority relatively quickly. I say relatively quickly, by the early 17th century, right? Such that they can defeat, well, they start defeating native navies before then, but by then, by around about 1700, they're unchallengeable at sea because of the superior firepower and the small, fast ships that they have. On land, it takes them a lot longer to do that. And though they're very effective in the Americas against poorly organized native foes, and because there are valuable things in America, they go out and conquer it. I'll explain that in a minute. But even in Africa, where they're not confronted by highly civilized powers, if you permit to use that word, they can't, in effect, because it doesn't seem to be terribly valuable, they can't put decent forces on land, and they basically have to stay within range of the forts they establish on the coast, which are protected by their naval squadrons. And in India, they are clearly inferior to the British are inferior to the Mughal Empire to begin with. The East India Company is the force that goes in. The East India Company is mobilizing its own soldiers and training native levies. But certainly we find that by the end of the 18th century, they do have a superiority. And what's decisive from the mid-18th century in India was the coordinated firepower of well-drilled infantry and artillery, given effective logistical support. So it is the kind of their ability to train and coordinate firepower. And this gives them the ability to win campaigns against a much larger native army that's sent against them, which often use the same level of musketry or cannonry, but don't have the same degree of ruthless training discipline. And so at some point, varying in the different continents, and if we take the story forward into the late 19th century and we get the magazine rifle and the Maxim gun and the steamship, then Africa too can be conquered with very small forces indeed. So that there is a military superiority. So we have a situation where Europeans can make profit through predation. And where you have such superiority, and there are resources worth taking, of course you do so. There is no restraint by liberalism or anything else. You seize the land and its mineral resources by force. You kill or drive off or enslave or use in forced labor the natives. If all you want to do is trade, you use military power to enforce unequal terms of trade, the so-called unequal treaties that are imposed on the other states of the world. You force them to use, this is supposedly a free trade empire, but you force them to use British ships. That's the important restraint. That's the important limitation of free trade after the mid-19th century for Britain. Well, the most lethal predation occurs where there were many settlers in the temperate zones who want the land but not the labor of the natives, or they can't use the natives. The natives are unwilling to work for them, perhaps. And there they use the firepower to drive them off. And, of course, they drive them off onto marginal lands, and the combination of European diseases and the kind of less effective nutrition on the marginal lands produces an enormous death rate, and so we have the resulting combinations of ethnocide and genocide, genocidal waves across the North American continent and in Australia. And in these cases, in the North American case, about 98% of the natives die, and in Australia it's about 75%. Of course, disease is the biggest killer, but there is indifference to this. So it's often treated as the divine hand of God, of providence, favoring them because they are the chosen people. In comparison with this, slavery seems rather mild. In Europe in the 16th century it was dying out, but it was revived for overseas use and expanded through the 17th and 18th century. Now, it's not started by the British, but by 1650 The British are carrying more slaves than anyone else, and by the 1770s, they're carrying the absolute majority of slaves. And by that time as well, British colonies are using most of the slaves, and British slave plantations develop the most efficient regime of mass production, geared to the first mass consumer markets of modern societies. As Daniel Defoe declared in 1713, no African trade, no Negroes, no Negroes, no sugar, no sugar, no islands, no islands, no continent, no continent, no trade. That is to say, farewell to your American trade, your West Indian trade. And though obviously this also involves coercion in the first place, imposed by Arab traders and African chiefs on board ships. Once on board ships, it's the British who are doing most of it. St. Francis Xavier said that empire was, I quote, to conjugate the verb to rob in all its moods and tenses, and no one conjugated it better than the British. India was plundered initially. That's what the East India Company was about. And this continued on the frontiers of expanding empire well into the 20th century. The return of plunder to Britain was enthusiastically greeted there, and wars were generally presumed to pay for themselves out of the plunder. Now, how central this was to the European economic miracle, more specifically now the British economic miracle, remains controversial. And I myself downplayed it in the Sources of Social Power, Volume 2, because most economic historians then said it provided only about 1% of British annual GDP. However, now I think there are two qualifications to that. First is that I was rather influenced by my friend Patrick O'Brien, who's changed his mind and says that all these estimates are biased for technical reasons and they understate the imperial contribution. He says there's no reason to doubt what contemporaries themselves believed, that it was immensely profitable and beneficial for the British economy. And in the second place, there are particular colonies and particular periods which clearly were profitable. And around the 1770s is quite critical. The profits of slavery provided anywhere between, the estimates range between 21% and 55% of total British investment capital at a critical moment. That is the moment of the build-up of the Industrial Revolution. That is, a lot of the investment capital comes from that. And it also allowed the sugar mills and the plantation labor with the labor control, the first industrial, as it were, labor control methods. And it's generally assumed that this was in some ways models for British factories. Now, the biggest economic impact came from the worst predators, the white settlers. Now, Neil Ferguson right now. He's recently extolled the economic beneficence of the British Empire. He displays tables showing considerable growth in some parts of the empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this is his main evidence for saying that the British Empire brought great growth, economic growth to the world. But bizarrely, his figures are for Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, the white dominions. They had the highest growth rates in the world, above even the United States, which Ferguson should really have included as well, since it's the same kind of white settler colony. Now, this impressive growth is due to the elimination of the native population and the implantation of settlers using the most advanced British methods or European methods of capitalist agriculture there. So I'm not sure if Ferguson is saying that if we British could only have survived in the tropics as well as in the temperate zones, we could have exterminated the natives everywhere and successfully developed the whole world. But that would, of course, not be a triumph of liberal empire. Nonetheless, it's true that the empires, especially the British empires, tended to become milder as they developed. Okay? And so I'm going to ask how that happened, right? And what it owed to liberalism. And this will take me into political and ideological power relations. Now, in political power relations, I want to make a simple point, that it's the logistics of power that far outweigh the nature of the constitution that matters for the development of the political regime in the empire. In the settler colonies, you can rule through settlers, and there is settler self-government, effectively, and then they rebel, and they achieve full self-government, and they become the most liberal states in the world. But outside of settler colonies, if you don't have many settlers, how do you rule? You've conquered them with tiny armies and navies. You simply do not have the manpower to rule them. You have to rule through native elites. And that's the essential political limitation of the European empires outside of settler colonies. So you have to bring in the native elites. Okay? Now, it's clear that at some, and they're doing that as a matter of practical necessity. Now, so far as I know, there's no talk about bringing eventual self-government to the natives until at some point well after 1850. I mean, I don't know exactly when this starts yet, but I haven't been able to find anything where there's any notion of a gradual progression of native colonies towards eventual self-government until the later 19th century. But then this idea does develop, and there is the notion of eventual self-government. However, the time span envisaged remains long. I quote here from Frederick Haugaard in 1926, and then from the Colonial Secretary Malcolm MacDonald in 1938, son of Ramsay MacDonald. I'll quote Malcolm MacDonald. It may take generations or even centuries for the people in some part of the colonial empire to achieve self-government, but it's a major part of our policy, even among the most backward peoples of Africa, to teach them and then to encourage them always to be able to stand a little more on their own feet. This is 1938. Now, of course, the time frame they had in mind was not that of the natives themselves. There is the gradual development of governors' councils with appointed native representatives on them, and then who are obviously always from the kind of native elites, and then in India some local government with some kind of property franchise for natives, and there are that occurs around about World War I, and then after World War I in India there is a further advance at the kind of national level at some spheres. In some spheres of policy, local representatives have some powers, but they're still subject to the governor, who has to approve all legislation. There's some gradual development, but in all cases this is achieved as a result of struggle by the native peoples themselves, by the Indians especially. And of course it is the great paradox that when you finally get a little bit of development in India around about 1900, just before 1900, and in Africa in the 1940s, it generates an African kind of middle class who promptly become nationalists and want to throw you out. So there is a kind of continuous pressure on this. And if we therefore go towards ideological power, we find that that there is this notion of a kind of we are a liberal empire, and that we are eventually going to bring self-government, but this is fundamentally undercut by another feature, especially strong in the British Empire, which is racism. Now, there is a political recognition that we have to rule through Indian elites and African chiefs. This is politically recognized, and so there is pragmatic sharing of power with these people. But it's undercut by a racism, which means that they can never be assimilated, they can never be British. And the French, too, for all their talk of assimilation, people are not actually assimilated because the French government cannot put the resources into making this real. And so we have this kind of undercutting in essentially the private realm, the domestic realm of racism, where you can't admit Indians into your private lives, and whereas in the East India Company period up until 1780, 1790, you have about 1/3 of the known wills left by East India office officials who are leaving substantial property to Indian women, and therefore they're either their wives or their partners in some other sense. There's a substantial intermarriage, and substantial mixed race children. This is banned by the East India Company in the 1780s and 1790s, and racism increases then through to 1830. It doesn't have very much to do with social Darwinism. It has much more to do with patriarchal conceptions and sexual conceptions of purity which begin before then and which undercut it. So that the notion that you can assimilate empire is the natives is continually undercut by racism, which of course is stronger in the British and the other liberal empire, the French, than it is in the non-liberal empire. So there are these contradictions. Now, eventually, it is the kind of the British and the French are thrown out, of course, and World Wars I and II play a considerable part in this. In the first time, well, not the first time in India, the British Empire has always relied on Indian troops, but there are about 3 million native African or Asian troops used by the British in World War II, and this is an enormous contribution, and there is the development of infrastructures of communication in Africa through World War II, and the sending of far more raw materials back to Britain as part of the war effort, and that this encourages the development of labor unions, of middle-class Africans, the like, who become the core of nationalist movements, so that the development and the war necessity is the final thing that throws them out. Now, some people say, well, it's because the Indians read John Stuart Mill. But the natives could clearly see the contradictions between Mill's liberalism when applied to the British and his views that Indians, Chinese, and Africans were incapable of self-rule because of their long-standing Oriental despotism and defective domestic life. So one might say that John Locke was also sat on the board that legitimized slavery in the earlier period. I don't think that the fact that the British were supposed to be espousing liberalism had a great deal to do with this contradiction. I think that the resistance to foreign rule is pretty basic across all times and places, and if you're being encouraged on the one hand and being told that this is an empire to your benefit, which all empires have always said, I mean, the British are no peculiar in that respect, but you're denied it, and you're denied even what the Roman and Chinese empires managed to do, which was to assimilate. If you're racistly excluded, then it's pretty commonsensical that they don't have to have read John Stuart Mill or Karl Marx to rebel against this. So, in conclusion, and there is a disastrous typo in the first line of my conclusion in the written version, the European empires entwined production and predation well into the 20th century. Politically and ideologically, it was true that the British Empire was rendered a little milder by a religious-flavoured liberalism, which I haven't talked about, the abolition of slavery, that kind of thing. But it was rendered milder still by the political logistics of rule by the few over the many. It was then destroyed ideologically by its own racism and by the transparent hypocrisy of colonial liberalism in the eyes of the natives it ruled. When some limited economic production for the benefit of some natives began to finally accompany predation in the British Empire in the late 19th century in India and in the 1940s in Africa, the empire was doomed. It fell quite rapidly, though this was also assisted by the world wars. Liberalism was important in the development and disintegration of the British Empire, but as a complex mixture of ideals, hypocrisy, and unintended consequences. Perhaps Hegel might have regarded this as the cunning of liberal reason. But whereas I believe that the world was brought great benefits by the European and especially the British miracle at home, the blessings brought by their imperial miracle are much harder to perceive. It is, of course, impossible to imagine a counterfactual world without modern empires to assess whether Asia, the Americas, and Africa would have been better off without empires. Had European expansion been genuinely liberal rather than imperial, and embodied profit rather than predation, then the benefits would have been much easier to perceive. Okay.
Previously, for me, you skip over, let's call it southeastern underbelly of Europe towards Iran, all that space, which of course was under the Ottomans, and there British especially had a lot of stakes, and they have done interesting politics, which ended up in formation of what was a kind of indirect rule as well, the Emirates, and in Egypt also, and played also, like elsewhere, like in South Africa, against the previous power or parallel France or Dutch in South Africa, pushed out predecessors in colonization. So I'd like your comment perhaps about that area, which is now in the limelight as a kind of possible threat for Europe. And second, you mentioned the overland difficulties. I think what should be stressed, even though it's not the history of the British Empire, but the overland expansion of Russia towards the Pacific is a fascinating story of colonialism, even though the numbers were, of course, small, and they couldn't stand much that thrust, but of course there was China, and there was Central Asia, which also sort of stopped eventually. Afghanistan stopped only 1979, the Russians.
Mm.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, I didn't talk systematically about any region. Yeah. There are these terms that the literature has: direct empire, indirect empire, informal empire, and the countries don't fit, regions don't fit neatly into them. I didn't really talk very much about the cut. The Middle East tends to be a kind of cut between indirect and informal empire. It's not merely informal because there are many direct interventions. But yeah, well, I mean, the crucial thing for the British Empire is Egypt and the Suez Canal. Actually, that's the thing that matters most until there is the notion of oil.
Also, French sort of involved.
Yes, and there is an Anglo-French. A tug of war. There is a partnership, but also yes. The Russian Empire is yes. I've only been talking about overseas empires, and so I though Ireland is technically overseas, it's so close that it's almost like an empire. What I call an empire of a neighbourhood, right? And this is how the European empires all started, colonizing their neighbourhood. And the Russian Empire is a land empire colonizing its neighbourhood. And though actually the numbers involved, of Russians involved, is rather larger over the long run than it is in any of the cases I've been looking at, apart from the settler colonies. So the kinds of empire that you get are a bit different. There can also be more ferocious, because you can, an army can go out and be followed by administrators, and they can carry on punishing rather than just have a punitive raid, which then you get some chiefs who then will ally with you. Well, though the Russians do that on the far frontier, they also systematically integrate it. So it's more ruthless, as is the Japanese Empire, which is also going in its neighborhood. You can do more ruthless things in Korea than the British could in any of these cases.
Two points. The first one is I know Patrick O'Brien's changed his mind, but from 1% to what percent? He doesn't give us any percent. There is quite a large literature still which says that the 19th century empires, India is an exception, don't make enormous profits. Germany, after all, tries, gives up its empire, doesn't stop its economic development. I'm still unpersuaded of one part of the argument. Don't doubt the hideous effects in certain parts of the world to them, but whether it was necessary for European economic growth, I still think that's unproven, and I'd like you to say a bit more about that. Second thing is, do you have some view or theory about the differences in legacies of different empires, in that some of them seem to have been wholly predatory and forgotten, and I went to Indonesia and so on. There isn't a trace of Dutch, not a trace. Whereas if you go to India, people start talking about Agatha Christie and Jane Austen on the train. Astonishing sort of continuity. There's some legacy, some of which I don't want to sound like Neil Ferguson, but one or two elements of which possibly weren't bad.
Yeah, I'm not rejecting anything that you say. I mean, I'm compressing a lot here in this paper and especially in the talk. India is essential for the British Empire as a whole. It's looting India throughout is what enables Britain to finance its balance of trade deficit and to maintain sterling as the reserve currency. Everyone accepts that. It's really it is the jewel in the crown. It also provides a large number of troops for the rest of the empire. Okay, so India is. Africa isn't. The African colonies are generally expected to pay their way, but that is to pay for themselves. But you're not making any serious profits. The British government certainly isn't making any profits. Some of the trading companies are, and if they really have to mount a substantial expedition, when Gordon is killed, and you do have to mount, you have to punish them, then that does cost the taxpayers a substantial amount of money. And the scramble for Africa is all about there might be something there, and we don't want them, the British or the French, to get there first, and Bismarck eventually joins in. So that's about it. Still, it has the same possible motive, but there are all these, in every period of history where you have discussion of empires, there are always these three motives which kind of, the historians argue about. There's, the economic plunder, or in the case of the more developed European empires, the exchange of raw materials for manufactured goods, the economic ones. The second one is the kind of strategic defensive kind of, which I just explained in the African case, that you want to go there in case someone else goes there, or you want to extend your own security and you go further out. And the third one is the civilizing mission, which in most periods of history people say is somewhat secondary, it's somewhat after the fact, and is the main way that you justify to your people what you're doing. So it's been noted by 1900, this new book by Bernard Porter, which is an excellent book. He says that it's clear from British opinion around about 1910 that the British conceive of the empire as a gigantic charitable institution. Right? And it's also true of the American thing. We hear far more of democratization in Iraq afterwards than we did before, and this was also true in the burst around 1898 to 1902 of American colonialism. So no, I'm not saying it makes an enormous. I think it makes a boost at a critical time. I'm saying two things: a boost at a critical time. No one can quantify it. If the statistics are biased in the way that O'Brien says they are, we have no better ones. That's number one, and number two is India for the British Empire. But in the other cases, they don't. But the more informal kinds of, part of a broader argument I have that by and large, all of the empires mainly move towards less direct, more indirect, more informal, and the US does this above all. The American empire is essentially informal, apart from this latest burst of adventurism. And that it's this that brings most benefit to the world. You know, why does Latin America do better than any of the colonies in the 19th century? Why does it do better than India or anything? Well, one of the reasons is it is only informal empire. You know, there is a kind of, you know, an ability for them to develop their own industries and not have them wiped out by British competition at the same time as they benefit from British trade arrangements. And that would have done a lot more benefit for the world if it had been this kind of half-liberal, informal imperialism, where you still have the gunboats. You know.
Yeah. I'm a little surprised by your positive assessment of the history of Latin America, but that wasn't my question. My question relates to one specific element in your paper and in your presentation, which was part of your argument as well, where you described Europe as peculiarly militaristic compared to other parts of the world. And I'd like to hear more about this. Difficult to quantify these things, obviously, but when I read this in your paper, I was surprised. And I was surprised partly because of, you know, the studies I've been doing recently of the Islamic world, where it seems to me that warfare, predation, plunder have been part of the way of life of the elites there for centuries. Of course, it was going on, as it were, at least part of the time, inside a supposed empire. The caliphate of the Abbasid Empire. But that was really a formality. It had very little actual power, the caliphate, and there was continual warfare within it, between different groups. A series of different dynasties of, you get the Buyids, you get the Seljuk Turks, you get the Ottoman Turks, and so on, continually overthrowing one after the other. When you get, how did the Ottoman Empire come into existence? By warfare, of course. It spread itself from its Anatolian homeland to over the entire Islamic world, not quite, but most of it, including all the Arabic parts of it, by force, by violence. This was sort of normal, natural. This is what you do if you're a ruling class, if you've got the power to do it. In the period when you had the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire in Iran, they fought continually, even though they were both Muslim, to stop them fighting. So I don't know. I mean, you mentioned in your paper China. Maybe China's the exception. They managed to pacify a large part of the world, but elsewhere, and India as well, where the Muslims, of course, expanded by violence, continual warfare. So I just don't know what the basis is for you saying that the Europeans were peculiarly militaristic.
Well, I have to qualify. I mean, I don't object to anything you said. I don't disagree with anything you've said there about the Muslim world. I don't know enough about it, to be perfectly honest. What I say in the paper is that this struck me first when reading, you know, Miguel Centeno's book about Latin America, is that wars are relatively, he quantifies it, wars are relatively infrequent. I mean, Latin America's been a multi-state system for 200 years, and he says the Tilly-Mann argument doesn't apply about the development of the modern state, because Latin America is exceptional. Jeffrey Herbst has written about Africa in the post-colonial period and says, well, there's a lot of fighting in Africa, but there's very, very few interstate wars. The Tilly argument doesn't apply here. Africa is exceptional, he says. Well, then I I think about standalone empires, what I call standalone empires versus rivalrous empires. Now, the Chinese empire obviously is consolidated by an enormous amount of warfare, and then it appears to be, it's basically a standalone empire. It's dominant over Asia, but there aren't a vast number of wars. But I haven't seen anybody quantify that, I have to say that. Now, the European case, obviously one has to add certain characteristics about this. Okay. It is a process of the kind of, Europe starts with this large number of kind of some areas of virgin territory and some of almost stateless and some of very feeble states. And there are however many 300 and something states still left in the 16th century. And European history is about the gobbling of all of these up by the bigger states. War is unusually rational there, is what I'm saying, because they can gobble up the small states. They can then, when they fight against each other, it's a kind of deflection kind of warfare. they rarely destroy each other. They almost never destroy each other. If you fight a war, if Austria and Prussia fight a war, it doesn't result in the destruction of Austria. It means that some of the minor states under Austrian protection are transferred to Prussia, and this is typical, This is, and it carries on going right through. Now, eventually, of course, Europe destroys itself in the culminating wars, but before that happens, and there's a failure to achieve a single empire in this case, but before that happens, all of the techniques pioneered in the latest stage of this go out to the world. So there's this extraordinary opportunity. But they're using the same techniques. And so what I try and do is trace the continuity of the forms of war through it all. Well, they're cumulative.
Is it the forms of war or the quantity of war that matters?
Well, I mean, the forms of war the techniques of making war are forged in a mixture of the frequency and the form. And I've said the form because you can gobble up the smaller states. So it's unusually rational because it's not a zero-sum game. And even when they're out in the colonies, when Britain finally achieves these great victories, you're not taking land in France. You're taking parts of the French Empire, and France is still left with some of them, parts of it. So it's still unusually, if you win, it's unusually profitable, and even if you lose, it's not a disaster until the 20th century.
I'd like to make a couple of comments connecting to some of the Gellnerian themes of homogenization in the context of imperialism. I think your brief account of the demise of empire is wholly, it's credible. And you also made some remarks about cultural homogeneity, diversity, exclusion, and so on that I'd just like to make a comment on and maybe ask a question about. Because it was not just in the, as it were, white settler colonies that there were attempts to indigenize and to colonize not just the areas, but to turn them into more European places. As you know, there were huge attempts at planting English fruit trees in Tasmania, but not only that, introducing European salmon in Indian rivers and in the East African highlands. You also have attempts, to grow typical English plants because you had a climate which made it possible. And there was a notion among colonials, quite early on in America, that if you grew up in the colony and you were exposed to the sun of the colony and you ate the foods, the indigenous foodstuffs, such as maize, for example, it made you into a different kind of person. So there were people in the 1600s who would, in America, would write about not being English anymore because the very bones of my body are made up by American grains and American corn and so on. So in an attempt to counteract this, partly colonials introduced British, as it were, foods and plants and so on. So that's one form of homogenization that we might want to look more at. There have been a few books, but not nearly enough. But at another level, if we look comparatively at these empires, obviously what happened in the East African highlands was that you had very large entropy-resistant groups, and you couldn't exterminate them because there were too many of them. You just couldn't kill all the Africans. So the British eventually had to go because there was no attempt at assimilating them. Now compare that to the Portuguese method of colonialism, where it is said that the Portuguese did their colonizing in bed. Where you had, as it were, also a situation in Brazil where no creolized version of the Portuguese language developed. Neither in the Spanish-speaking colonies did the creolized version of Spanish develop, but in the Dutch, English, and French colonies, the British and French colonies, you got creolized versions of the language. Now, what does this tell us? I don't know, but it tells us something, about these sort of Gellnerian notions of how societies are put together. So the question is, do you think religion has anything to do with it? I'm thinking of slave revolts in the Caribbean. The slave revolts, yeah, but seriously. You think like plot religion out there? No?
Yeah, no, not really. Because I'm just thinking about the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion in the terms of colonialization, where the Spanish and the Portuguese followed a very different line. Where in the British colonies there was always a very strong sort of dividing line between us and them. Even the French had their notion of évoluer, where you could in fact become a black Frenchman in the way you couldn't become a black Englishman. So the slave revolts
the most violent slave laws, you had them in Guyana and Jamaica, in the Caribbean, not in the French, not in the Spanish colonies. And they were sent to Barbados, which was like a penal colony because it's flat. It's not like like a panopticon. You could just put up a tower in the middle of the island and basically have a few guards there with weapons, and they could keep an eye on everything that was going on. So it was like prison. And yes, I'm just wondering, does religion have anything to do with the peculiar forms of exclusion that developed in the British Empire, which they didn't have in the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the French?
Yes, I think it's a complicated story, and the answer is yes, it does have something there. But I think the most fundamental thing is the kind of the form of the economy. That is, if you have in temperate zones, you have the opportunity to farm, and you have settler families going out, and therefore you
labour, and the natives don't seem like very good labour anyway, and they're not willing to work, then this is the most devastating thing that can happen. And you've got a mixture of things. You've got a kind of, a continuum, The settlers wanting the land and not the labour, settlers wanting the land, wanting to use labour. You've got the extractive mines, which is highly coerced, but not usually by slave labour. It's more usually efficient to have a relationship with heads of villages and things where they will provide a certain amount of labour and you use it extremely callously, and then you go through towards trade. Now, in the initial trading kind of entrepreneurs, there's an enormous amount of intermarriage, even among the British, so that initially there isn't a kind of, a strong racism. But then I think there is a difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, and I don't know when it starts, but people say that it's impacted by the rise of evangelicalism in the early 19th century, when notions of the chosen pure people kind of grow. But certainly from the 70s, then the British as the main slavers are very much influenced by that. And the conventional story is, I think, that racism comes primarily from slavery. That's where, these are, highly intelligent people trying to articulate the differences between power and civilizational levels. So racism is placing them in an evolutionary scheme above each other is an obvious way of doing it. And you can't do that with the Indians to begin with, because they're obviously your equals in many ways.
Yeah, very compatible culturally. You have, caste, and Indian caste and British caste mirroring one another.
Yes, and they seem to reinforce. That's right. And Indian caste seems to solidify it at the same point that the British are increasing their racial boundaries. So there's obviously some complicated relationship between them. So it's not just the British. There are barriers occurring on the Indian and the Muslim side as well. So I think religion does have a point in terms of, facilitating or not intermarriage, and I think that's the main part of it.
You can think of this just in terms of entropy negative, the Gellnerian terms. In the Catholic colonies, there was a tendency that you might say, a social structure of hierarchical inclusion, so that the slaves were somehow, if they were converted to Christianity, somehow part of the family. They were junior members, they were treated like children, but you had more responsibilities towards them.
Yes.
While in the British and Dutch colonies, you had fences. It was us and it was them.
Yes. Yes. As far as the French is concerned, I think that if empires had been genuinely benevolent in the economic sense and produced development, then the French évolué and assimilationism might have worked.
Yes.
But it was hamstrung by the fact, that the colonial administrators would write back to Paris and say, we need more resources. And in Paris they'd say, sorry, we got no cash to spare. And so it was only rhetoric, the assimilationism. So there were, as you say, a few evaluated. Yeah.
Mark's question is next.
My question is basically, you show, I think quite convincingly, that it's counterintuitively the case that the liberal states were actually particularly exploitative in their empires and so on. What I want to ask you is there anything in liberal ideology which might explain that, or is it all external? In other words, this particular situation which the British found themselves in India and in Africa, using labour, not using labour. These are external elements. Would there be anything within liberalism itself which might explain?
Well, I think there's kind of there's one and a half kind of direct linkages. I mean, the half one is the more problematic one, you know. But the obvious direct one is the higher the level of representative government back home, and where you have settlers, therefore, the more self-government effectively the settlers have in de facto terms, the worse they are. Right? That's a direct connection. On the other hand, I mean, but that's not the main part of the story. Is still settler families not wanting the labour, but it's clear, you know, from my analysis in the Dark Side of Democracy book that you know, when California gets statehood, when there's genuine autonomy from Washington, which is restraining it a bit, there's more. And as there is in American colonial history, when the British are kicked out, there's more. In each Australian state, as they get statehood, it gets worse. So there's that. That's the direct connection. The half is the suggestion that some people have made in that the free-born Englishman, you know, the kind of core part of the British notions of liberties, does have an ethnic component. That's what some people say, and they say it is the free-born Englishman, and it becomes the Briton, you know, by some point in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and it is an exclusive form of thing. But I don't know. I mean, it's difficult to prove that.
In terms of liberalism, that's racism grafted onto liberalism.
Oh well, it's intrinsic to British liberalism, English liberalism, okay, yeah. English liberties. So you're right, not as an abstract political philosophy, but abstract political philosophies are only ideal types. You know, we're talking about the reality here of British liberties, English liberties, and British.
Nicholas has a question.
I can see the linkages you make between wars and the imperial miracle. Are there linkages between wars and the European miracle? Is that partly how you explain it?
You include the last publication, or
yeah,
it was about the exclusive access to diamonds and gold. And once it was won by the British, then until today, this is an income coming through those companies, and of course through the political power, and even throughout the African power. Until, as I say today, gold is determined in London, etc. And I think it's very interesting. At the same time, the defeated South African general, Jan Christian Smuts, was the first to propose, in the wake of First World War, the abolishment of empire. He proposed it in 1919, I think, and I think it was accepted by the Imperial Council to some extent.
Yes, I mean, yes, South Africa is important, and it's also it's important for Britain. It's the first war that has a big impact in Britain, because it doesn't look as if it's going to be won for some considerable time. It's a great shock, and it costs a lot. But yes, it is profitable. South Africa becomes a dominion, as the others are also becoming. Yeah. And of course, the Boers win, actually. They get control of South Africa.
But not because the capital was mostly in the hands of the English.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Until today, the skimming of profits is still coming.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Well, we have to close.